Hi, everybody. This is Tanishka, and welcome to the Third Eye webinar. So, the third eye is the place where we journey deep into the inner realms and we explore the inner landscape. And in a culture that bases worth and value upon what we do, what we can look back and prove has been a valuable use of our time by, evaluating it from the perspective of the five earthly senses, which is, touch, taste, sound, sight. Oh my goodness. I'm trying to think of them all. It's morning here. Anyway, the five earthly senses. So, when we're called to initiation by Hecate and Hermes, the biggest challenge that we have to get past is our own rational mind, which can view it with absolute terror and create stories around it that are debilitating. For example, we might attach to it the stigma that, this is a sign of mental illness if we don't have the energy for the outside world. If there's so much that's coming up internally for us that we can't face the day, that we just need to stay put and incubate in a sort of womb-like space in our bed under the doona. I think doona is an Australian term, so duvet, I think is the English term. Not sure about America. But anyway, under the covers. So what happens with these inner descents, it's literally that spiral journey down to meet the disowned aspects of ourselves, or the dark, which is the feminine. Now, that isn't to say that the feminine is evil, but the feminine is the part of us that resides within, whereas the masculine is, the persona, what can be seen in the light of day, our personality, our social mask that we've constructed based on the feedback that we've gotten that is, this is acceptable socially. So to take that journey, that spiral journey inwards, is confronting, to say the least, in a culture that doesn't or hasn't valued the feminine and the feminine journey and hasn't understood it. So it's labelled, it's misinterpreted as a negative thing, as a sign of weakness and failure and something to be fixed and solved and medicated, rather than embraced as a shamanic journey. Now, in the ancient world, before the rise of, the patriarchal empires like Rome, both men and women were encouraged to take this journey and were revered. Those that undertook this journey, which is the journey that you've all taken, around spring equinox, were revered in, the festival of the dying god, one who was prepared to confront their ego and have an ego death in order to birth the greater self, have that soul rebirth. So these were considered the true heroes and heroines, those that undertook that journey. The other thing that I want to say, there's a lot to be said, but we'll get to it all, is that Hecate and Hermes, the feminine and masculine archetypes, sort of the grandmother and the grandfather, or the mystic and the sage, they are always present at every crossroads. Now, I'm not just talking about physical crossroads, but the times in our life of great upheaval, of crisis and change. And if we understand that, we can attune to their energies, we can invoke them for guidance or to amplify our subtle senses so we can intuit which way to go, even in a split second, because we can access all the information through our subtle senses in, a microsecond, which is impossible through the rational mind. So it's often, interestingly enough, those that have been exposed to trauma early, who have a strong Hecate and Hermes archetype, because if we feel unsafe as children, whether that's emotionally, mentally, physically, or psychically, we turn on our subtle senses as a survival mechanism. So we learn very quickly to read a situation, to perceive what's going on that is not spoken, that is not apparent with the naked eye. And so we can then access those gifts to help others later in life, because we've had to develop them early. So often those that are, healers and way showers and readers and teachers are those that have often had a very turbulent childhood, have had an early loss of innocence, have had an initiation into the underworld early. And that has acted as a catalyst for their wisdom to be accelerated, to gain insight beyond their age, so that they can then fulfill their mission, to light the way through the darkness of that inner labyrinth of the rational mind, to then help others later in life. Now, I think it's important to add that the underworld, it is inevitable that we journey there. The difference is whether we go there willingly or whether, we go there in a way that is almost like being hurtled down through a chasm that we feel, we're fighting every inch of the way. And like anything, if we resist, we suffer. So one of the biggest challenges at the third eye is to surrender. As I'm recording this, it's a lunar eclipse, and this is just perfect in terms of, an initiation into third eye, because what a lunar eclipse does is it's when the sun, the earth, and the moon are all directly in a straight line. So, and it only happens during a full moon, and it's when the earth obscures the moon from receiving the light of the sun. So instead of the moon shining like a beacon, it has the shadow of the earth projected upon its face. And so instead of us feeling light and optimistic as we would with a full moon, we can feel overwhelmed by our own shadow and the collective shadow. And if we think about Hecate and Hermes, they initiate us by taking us into the underworld, by noticing the shadow in ourselves and in others, to the point where our light dims. We don't feel as optimistic. We don't feel as courageous or as hopeful. And the lack of light is what causes us to go deeper and deeper into those shadowy realms within, like going to the bottom of the well. Now, from a patriarchal perspective, the underworld was seen as hell, named after the Norse goddess Hel, H-E-L, with just one L. But it was appropriated and distorted and came to mean or be perceived as a place of punishment. And this is, coming from that model of good and bad, right and wrong. But in the earlier matriarchal times, which honoured both sacred feminine and sacred masculine, the underworld was simply the womb of the Great Mother, where we would return on a cyclic basis for renewal, to grow wise by looking at our shadow, by becoming humbled, by surrendering to great mystery on a deeper level, and using that time of deep incubation to integrate more of those disowned aspects so that we can return more whole, and with more wisdom, more pearls to offer as a legacy, as a wisdom keeper. And so there wasn't the stigma, there wasn't the fear associated with, being in the inner sanctum. In fact, in ancient Egypt, they would have priests and priestesses that would assist people by putting them into, almost like a sarcophagus, I suppose today's version will be a flotation tank, where you're put into an enclosed chamber in the dark in order to facilitate deep going within, in order to have that shift in consciousness, that rebirth. So I remember when I was in labour with my daughter, well, pre-labour, I saw Hecate standing in the room, and it said that, Hecate and Hermes are present at every death and every birth. So if you have the opportunity to be present at either, obviously your own, but, if life arranges it so that you are present at the passing, whether it's of a bird, whether it's of, a human, or, to be present when a friend is birthing, you might just like to attune to their energies. In fact, that's work, very important work, that's returning as the consciousness of the sacred feminine rises, being a midwife, a spiritual midwife, to support those making that inner journey during death and birth. Because what happens is we don't just go to, the void, the place of absolute mystery, of darkness, of the unknowable, in order to rebirth ourselves. But we go there to get the soul of the child that we're birthing. We go there when we die. And that can be terrifying for people that haven't done the work to unveil their different archetypes, because if they haven't found the light within, and particularly these archetypes, that darkness can feel so terrifying and so overwhelming, that it's not the blissful experience that transition can be. We can demand to see the light, and then end up back into the wheel of rebirth. Whereas if we have learnt to develop the inner light within, we can stay in the darkness. We can be at peace, in full trust and surrender to the divine plan, and allow ourselves to just exist weightlessly in existence, in union with existence. And then when we're ready, use the power of intention, okay, the power of our own inner third eye, acknowledging that we have the spark of creation. We are potential creator beings if we choose to use it, and then set clear intention on what it is we would like to next explore. You know, we might like to go to the Akashic Records and have a look at, you know, what we've journeyed, so we can get clear on making a clear choice on what we would like to journey and learn next as a soul in our eternal immortal journey. So yeah, it's all the work that we're doing, having soul rebirths, having ego deaths, is the best preparation we can do for our physical transition back into, you know, being an energetic being rather than a being within physical form, an incarnated being. And, you know, that work, for those that choose to, you know, there's going to be an increasing demand for death doulas, you know, death midwives, assisting people and their families to be able to relax and surrender to that transition. So I'll speak now more specifically about each of those archetypes. So I've just made a few notes here that I'm going to refer to. So I might start with Hecate. I've gathered a few images from one of my favourite oracle decks, the Goddess Oracle, and I just wanted to share them with you. They're 3 images of the crone aspect, and the word crone came from the word crown, one who is crowned with wisdom. So when our silver hairs come through, this is an acknowledgement that, again, we've been through something which has matured us, which has developed our wisdom. So there, if you can see it, is an image of Hecate with Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that's said to guard the underworld. Now, this theme of her having 3 faces, often Hecate will be shown with 3 faces, indicating she is one who has journeyed the cycles experientially. So she has within her the understanding and the perspective of the maiden and that phase, and has distilled it within herself so she can be a mentor and a guide for those that are navigating the lessons of the maiden. So too for the mother phase. Even if she hasn't been a biological mother, she has certainly watched, listened and learned to those that have, as well as journeying through her own mother issues and self-care issues and mentoring, you know, nurturing rather other beings. I mean, in a traditional culture, all women of a certain age were called mother. All women of a certain age were called grandmother, because it was acknowledged that we didn't own our children and that the village collectively raised the children. So the issue of, you know, becoming a mother was not such a big deal because you didn't bear that burden on your own. So, and then finally, she's the one who journeys the lessons of the elder. And, you know, each stage is equal and different. We see here that she's wearing robes. You know, Hecate is probably the hardest archetype to consciously access because she's the most inward. So she often doesn't show herself vividly to us unless we are deep within our own, you know, psyche. We've really descended deep into a meditative state. So the robes also indicate that when we want to go inward, it helps to wrap ourselves in a pashmina or a robe that helps to block out, if you will, the external distractions that we can get caught up in. And just the energy current of wrapping ourselves in a robe helps to take our energy deep within. So there's a bit of flare there from the light. But she's a very benevolent being. We've been shown images of, crones as, witches that have warts on their nose and stooped backs. And so it's no wonder that so many women fear aging when so much value in a patriarchal culture is placed upon our appearance. But we're now seeing more and more images of women who are connecting with the cycles and living in a cyclic way, creating cyclic balance in their lives, so they are growing older with grace and acceptance. And so we're seeing images of beautiful elders, okay? Not the distortion of those trying to reclaim their youth, by using Botox and collagen to sort of plump up their lips and paralyze their face so that, they don't have aging lines. Just going to sneeze, I think. Oh, excuse me. So, but instead we're seeing women whose inner light shines through. So, and there's a sort of a softness to them. Excuse me. So they look, you can see it in their face that they're in their hearts, and there's a depth to them. There's an understanding when you look into their eyes, and overwhelming love, because ultimately our challenge as the elder woman and the elder man is to return to innocence. Okay, so we start off innocent. The soul that arrives is like a clean slate. We have no stories, no expectations. And then it is inevitable that we will experience the shadow of those that aren't fully self-aware and that act in a way that's unconscious, and that will impact us, and we will experience wounds on all levels: mental, emotional, energetic, and physical. And so the challenge is in understanding that, yes, we will feel angry, we will feel, envious, all those, what the Christians labeled the seven sins. It's like the shadow at the seven gates. We will experience all of it. But our challenge is to find the lesson in how we're feeling and sort of pull apart, extricate the experiences, the poison, the bitter, moments that we've had, and look for the lesson in it so that we can come to a place where we are genuinely grateful and understand that we chose those lessons. And that shifts it from the ego perspective of victimhood to the soul's perspective of wisdom, so that we're able to then open our hearts again fully like a newborn babe and be completely receptive, trusting, and open to the experience and process of life, understanding that the benevolent universe is always in service to us, that we don't need to contract in fear, which is what the ego does when we're confronted with chaos and crisis. For instance, if somebody dies when we're young, often the story that's gleaned from that and anchored is we can't trust life. Anything could happen at any time that could turn our world upside down. So we have to control everything. And then we tend to operate more out of the opposite chakra, which is the solar plexus, which is the mental plane, the lower mental plane, where we, try to have everything nailed down, everything so tightly scheduled that there's no room for mystery. And life will break that structure apart. And the more tight our sort of OCD, the bigger the fall, the bigger the catalyst will be to challenge those structures of control that we've put in place, so that we can inevitably have that ego death and crack open like a nut and experience something far greater, which, reinstates that sense of awe for the mystery that we have as little children when we learn about nature or we look at the stars and stargaze. We're full of light, we're full of wonderment. And so you'll notice with elders that they fall into two categories. Those who become hardened by life, those that are bitter and resentful, their anger has sort of calcified. And that's like a defense mechanism, because what's underneath is that terrified, wounded child who's operating out of fear. So this is somebody who's stuck in the lower chakras, who hasn't fully opened their heart and accessed the upper chakras. And this is when, at that initiation into our elder years that happens at 49, when Chiron, the planetoid, so not just the archetype of Chiron, so we've passed through the lesson of the throat gate. We've often had something, a huge catalyst to heal, because what Chiron does, it has a 49-year orbit, and when it ends up, when we're 49, it ends up in the place it was when we were born, and it brings up the biggest wound that we've come here to heal this lifetime. So it's our initiation into our elder phase. Now, this is a very confronting time for people, particularly men, because, being in your vulnerability in a patriarchal culture is, it means, from the perspective of a soldier, whether that's a corporate one or, somebody in the armed forces, it's the ultimate weakness exposed and signifies that you're feminine rather than masculine, which is considered a failure, which is horseshit, I might add. But the challenge at that crossroads from the mother phase or the father phase into the elder phase is to embrace your vulnerability, because it will, if we follow it, if we keep going deeper into it, it will take us to the absolute core wound. And I had the honour last weekend of initiating a girlfriend into her 50th, did ceremony, went away for the weekend. And she really was journeying her wound in a huge way, and catalysts had happened in her life which really brought up, the abuse that she'd had as a child. She could then see it being done to the next generation by her brother, and this just, brought sleeping issues right up to be felt and dropped her, right in her deepest trauma to be resolved. So when this happens, people will do one of two things. They will either look externally to be saved, like a child, to be rescued, to the men in white coats, to the medical profession, and seek to medicate themselves, seek a pill, seek, some form of external intervention. Or they will do what I described as the shamanic journey, which is because they've activated the inner healer at the throat. They're then ready for that inner journey. So the role of Hecate and Hermes is to go deep within and rescue the wounded child, so that they can restore the magical child, the one who trusts the divine plan and restores the lightness of being. And those that do that initiation journey, it can take a few years. Okay, I've witnessed this in friends that are in their early 60s, that, my closest friend, she's a Reiki master in her mid-60s. And in the lead up to her Chiron initiation, 49, she stopped teaching Reiki and became, quite bitter, and almost renounced everything that she'd held sacred. And then, through a catalyst, a sequence of events, really journeyed the dark, really felt so bitter about the world, about the collective, and lacked any hope and optimism for the collective future. And now, thankfully, she's coming out of that. And what happens when people emerge from that deepest descent? We go often through a deep descent at each one of the bigger initiations, the blood mysteries. So at puberty, pregnancy, our 40th, when Uranus is opposite the sun, midlife crisis. But I feel intuitively that the one into our elder years is the deepest, that all the others have been a preparation for that. In the Native American tradition, they say a woman attains her power at 50. And it's because she's sat in Moon Lodge and she's journeyed deep within as she's bled every month. And this has prepared her for that deep descent initiation of the elder gate. So what happens then when we've reclaimed the magical child? Our eccentricities start to be seen. This will be when you see elders in the community that have a streak of purple in their hair, or start wearing lots of colours, and decorate their homes in ways that are very playful. So it's very easy to see at a glance which path at that crossroads an elder has taken, whether they've started to atrophy and become the frail little old man or the frail old woman, and more childlike in a sense of, please take care of me, more and more dependent, or whether they're distilling their inner power. Now, at either way, this is, when the energy is waning. And so there is a humbling that happens with the physical body. So we have to have developed the soul in order to cope with that. Otherwise it is terrifying. It is too much for the ego to handle. If you can't do the things that you used to do physically. So, this phase, the elder phase, is very much about self-actualization. So developing a very, tangible relationship with spirit, with the unseen realm, which becomes more and more vivid as we age. And I've got another image here of Sheila Nagig. This is from the Goddess Oracle. It's a very disturbing image in some ways, because she is somebody who is decaying. Her body is, bony, and the skin is saggy, and she looks like death, but at the same time, she's luminous with light, and she's opening her sacred opening, her consciously, her yoni, and rebirthing herself and the universe. So Sheila Nagig is an archetype which I see that births within our consciousness at 60. And she's, the one who's preparing for conscious rebirth. The other image that I wanted to show you was Caredwin. Now here we can see she's like the Celtic version of Hecate or Hel. And here's her cauldron that she's stirring. She's distilling all of her life experiences. And it's said that whatever we surrender to Caredwin, so if life says, hey, you've got to let go of a loved one, whether that's a pet or a partner or a parent that's crossing over, or whether it's, something you have to have a breast removed. I've got another dear crone friend, the woman who mentored me initially into Women's Mysteries, that's taken that journey. And so it's said that whatever we are asked to surrender to Caredwin will be returned to us, but in a form that is useful. In other words, we can't stop the universe taking what it will take in order for us to be initiated and to get that lesson of surrender. But if we journey that surrender, if we allow it to happen and don't fight it, eventually it will be restored to us. I'll give you a small example of that I had once. Years ago, I had a labradorite pendant, a spiral goddess, which I loved, which I wore all the time and had been gifted to me. And I remember being at the Melbourne Mind Body Spirit Festival where I was speaking, and there was a young Maori girl, about 9, and her and her mother had come up to my stall, and I started getting downloads very strongly. This girl was being emotionally and psychically abused because her mother, wasn't coping, and she was taking it out on her daughter. And I got that this labradorite pendant needed to go to this child to help with psychic protection. And because it was a significant pendant, it was worth a bit of money, and I needed to ask permission from the mother rather than just gifting it to the daughter. And I also took her aside and explained why I was being impulsed to give it to her, and she was gracious in that she, was grateful and allowed it rather than being defensive. And I let it go. I trusted the giveaway. And then I was given one even more beautiful, so for me that was, and it came to me easily. I didn't, go looking for it or anything. So again, it was gifted. So I just want to make the point that, if ever you're instructed to give something away, to give it up, do it in that moment, okay? Because, everything has a journey, everything has a consciousness. And when we trust the mystery, we can sort of walk in a way that's not encumbered with materialism. So I need to get on to Hermes. With Hermes, look, he can be, when he's young, in a way too clever for his own good, because he's the archetype that can get by on his wits, can wing it, hence the wing sandals that he wears. And he can be a bit like, the perpetual teenager who gets off on seeing what they can get away with, particularly those that have a strong Hermes archetype. It's the archetype of the trickster, the magician, slippery like Quicksilver, Mercury, So they won't grow up until they get caught red-handed, until they're caught in the act. And then that's the best thing that can happen to them, because by them being humbled in that way, they have to look at themselves. And this is when they go from being out of integrity. Okay, the greatest lesson is right action, and to serve rather than being self-serving. So using their powers for evil instead of good. And so those that emerge from the underworld will often then become a champion of those still caught in the underworld. So, for instance, if, their journey is one of drugs, then they'll go to rehab, they might be sent there by the courts, and then they will dedicate their lives to assisting those that have also, lost their sovereignty to a dependency on a drug. Or you might see them, in the alleyways of the city, just going up and chatting to the untouchables, to those whose lives are completely, desecrated by drugs. Hermes was said to bring fateful chaos. I had an experience in my life where I was homeless for 10 months when my daughter was 5. And the lesson, there were a number of lessons, but the greatest lesson was that to use the power of the third eye for conscious intent. And I want to say at the outset that I thought that I had, I was given notice they were selling our place that we were renting. And so I wrote out a clear list of what I wanted in a new home, and had another sole parent that was going to share with us, because I'd identified that I needed the stimulus and assistance and support of another adult. But the day before the removalists came and we were moving, the other parent pulled out, and I couldn't afford to pay the rent on the house on my own. So our stuff was put into storage, and somebody took us in locally so I could keep my daughter at her kinder. But then after 2 weeks, they said, look, enough disruption. We need to get back to our lives. And then we were went from one friend's place to another. And in that chaos, it broke me. And I, was truly humbled by it, and then had post-traumatic stress, as did my daughter. But the great lesson in it was, I remember the last person that took us in, she had been a mother of 4 children that had to escape Canada and move to Australia due to extreme domestic violence. And while she, had a heart of gold, she didn't believe that anything was possible. So whenever I would say, I've been to look at more houses today and they were depressing, they had rising damp, they weren't suitable, she'd say, look, beggars can't be choosers. But I refused to accept that. And I kept holding fast to the vision that I had of a home that had natural light, that had a bath, that had a fire. In other words, it had the elements, it had nature. And I kept just absolutely committing to the knowing that I could manifest that. And I did. So we've been in that home now for 8 years. So, and I don't take it for granted either. But the point is that sometimes, when we choose, this is what I consciously manifest, and we don't get it, we can lose our faith in the divine. And that existential grief will spiral us into the underworld at a great hurtling speed that's alarming. To lose our trust, to lose our faith in the divine is the bleakest. And this is why, the path of the high priestess in the Kabbalah one has to go through Darth, the third eye, which is the center of chaos, of absolute blackness. And I do believe that, the initiation to develop our third eye is often something that comes out of left field that just, it's kind of like Dorothy in the tornado. It's so much bigger than us. We can try to keep things together, to control things, but it will blow it apart, because our lesson is to journey surrender. And then once we've learned how to surrender, which is that lesson of Hecate, then our lesson as Hermes is to go, okay, find your center, in the center of the hurly-burly, the cyclone, and get really clear. Be at one with spirit. Be grateful for the experience. Look for the lessons in the experience, and then consciously choose from that place what it is you now set as your clear intent. So we can invoke Hermes for insight and psychic protection. In our culture, there's an absolute denial about the need for psychic protection because we don't acknowledge the existence of entities, of lower astral thought forms, emotional miasmas, and just energies that are not incarnate, that are looking for a host, that are separate from the light and therefore attracted to the light in others because they're trying to find their way back to the light. So with both Hecate and Hermes, it's important that we become aware of the need for clearing our personal energy field on a regular basis and setting very strong, clear, energetic boundaries. And I do this every day. I'll visualize the violet flame spiraling up from a foot below me to a foot above me and just transmuting and collecting any lower fear-based thought forms, any dense emotions, any fear-based, emotions, and casting out any imposing entities, any imposing thought forms, and deleting any and all effects of them. And what this does is it reclaims our free will, and it sets very clear intention through the power of word that we are sacred and sovereign, that we energetically cannot be compromised or sullied in any way. And this means that then we can set clearer intention as conscious creators, as manifestors, without that being undermined by anything that is not in accordance with our own innate intelligence, our own higher self. So clearing the home is also an important practice to be done at every new moon. Just, again, visualizing the violet flame spiraling up through our home, and casting out any imposing entities and energies, and then anchoring a big column of light down through our home from the highest realms, from the great central sun down into the center of the earth. It's important to acknowledge too that at the crossroads of death and birth, people are vulnerable to entities. So because, they're going between the worlds, if in our culture people aren't taught to prepare their energetic body for that with appropriate protection, they're vulnerable. And so this is why a lot of women in particular end up with postpartum depression. They've picked up entities in their birthing experience, often brought on through birth trauma. Like attracts like. If we're experiencing really full on moments of fear and just absolute pain physically, we can attract to us vibrational frequencies that match that. So important to have an energetic healing after those big transitions, or if you've attended a transition, just to clear your field. Okay, because Hermes, I'm just going to have a drink. Because Hermes, the lesson of Hermes, he's the inner alchemist, is to integrate and balance feminine, masculine, and all those disparate parts. What did I want to say about that? An exercise we can do. That you can stand in front of a mirror and light a candle and cover one side of your face, okay? The left is the feminine, the right is the masculine. And you'll see when you look into your eye, you'll have a more feminine presence or quality in the left and a more masculine in the right. And you can just have a telepathic conversation with your feminine and ask it what it needs to feel supported, empowered, and healed. And then receive thoughts by looking deep into your eye, and then do the same for the masculine. This is just a process that you can do to help with that integration process. Okay, something else I wanted to share, another story, lots of stories. Interesting, I'm sharing through story a lot in this webinar. Okay, I suppose that is, what these archetypes do. It's kind of like the elders are the ones that will read bedtime stories or make up bedtime stories for their grandchildren. We learn through stories. They're medicine parables. But another story that I have to share is when I was in a car accident, and my then partner was driving my car, and he just turned the wheel and lost control of the car, and we did a 360, a 380, no, 360, 180. Anyway, the car spun onto the other side of the road. Fortunately, there was no oncoming traffic at the time. And then we ended up down an embankment, and he got out of the car and I was stuck in the car. I did get out. But the point is, at that moment when the car was spinning out of control, he was screaming, and I just felt absolutely calm, absolutely centered. And it was because at that moment there is nothing we can do except accept what is happening. And that is surrender, okay? Surrendering in the chaos. So all those experiences like the homelessness and all of that had helped prepare me for that moment. So no injuries were sustained. Just like it's said that, if you drop a baby, not that you do it intentionally, they will sustain less injuries than a young child, because a baby has no expectation of them being hurt when they hit the floor, so they completely relax. It's like up here on the mountain where I live, after a Saturday night or a full moon, you will often see a car that's stuck down the embankment with no driver in it, and if the driver is drunk, they will have gotten out, walked home, and sustained no injuries because they're inebriated, they relax. So when there's impact, when they're in chaos. So the lesson here is, no matter what is happening, go with it, okay? I heard another woman speak that was in a car accident, and while she did sustain injuries, you know, really she should have been dead. And it was because she also, in that moment, recognized just complete surrender. So, yeah, there's a serenity that comes in that. Oh, thank you. The storytellers in my notes here, Hermes communicates through metaphor, so he is the archetypal storyteller. How lovely. So he teaches us to question, to observe, and then act accordingly. So, you know, when I was speaking earlier about reading a situation, that's the ability that he gives us. Hecate and Hermes both see the shadow. There's nothing you can't get by them, because they have seen the shadow in themselves. So they often have a very piercing gaze. You know, they'll look deep into your soul rather than just taking somebody at face value. Yeah, look, that's all that I can think to speak on these archetypes right now. There's nobody who's come to attend the live webinar to be able to, you know, debrief and offer personal mentoring for whatever issues that you've been facing this month. So, yeah, I'll call it a day. I've spoken for an hour, and I hope that's been insightful for you, and wish you all the best in the next 2 weeks integrating the strengths of these archetypes. So thanks for taking the time to watch the recording, and I'll see you back here for our final webinar for the crown archetypes of Ishtar and Dionysus. Blessings.